Okay.
Okay.
Anywho, we're back. So during this time, I wanted to share some of the things that have helped me the most in my wellness journey. And of course, we talked to Dr. Lober, and I wanted to bring in someone who's been so impactful in my personal growth in the last year that I don't know. I mean, life changing probably. So this is Mandi Fraser. She is what is your exact title? I don't want to.
I'm a licensed professional counselor.
Okay, licensed
Yeah.
professional counselor.
Yes.
So in the past, and she was so gracious to do this with me. In the past, so I guess I started to go to her for energy therapy. And I think that was what attracted me to, that it was energy therapy, and I was really into, how the body works, how energy works. So when I first came home from Cincinnati and I was detoxing my body from these things, I didn't have control over some of the things that I always had control over, and it wasn't really the best time. And so one of my very good friends, who was a former collegiate athlete, told me about Mandi, and she was like, she literally has changed my life. And in the past, therapy, I equated it kind of like with therapy. And I think that therapy is really beneficial for a lot of people. In the past, it hasn't worked for me. It just hasn't. I have seen a couple of therapists for certain times in my life. Most of them, had to do with when I was younger, and maybe some boy issues, but not personal growth issues, but they just hadn't worked. So but I really trusted this friend. So I was like, okay, I'm going to give this a shot. So I did. And I've never looked back. I guess after the first meeting, I was like, I'm not sure, but it wasn't because of you. It was just because I didn't know how it worked. But so yeah, you really changed my life in terms of my thinking and how I go about I'm definitely less reactive, more responsive, all those things that everyone talks to when you're on the path to enlightenment and, inner joy and things like that. So I first want Mandi to tell everyone about her background a little bit, just so you can get a sense of where she's coming from, and then also what energy work is.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that nice introduction. Wow. So I want to piggyback off of what you were just saying, and I want to talk about misconceptions of therapy first. This isn't where you wanted me to start exactly, but I feel like I need to say this now. I want to talk about my philosophy in the way that I treat. And I think a lot of people have misconceptions about what therapy is, according to what they see on TV or, on shows, and, oh, I have to go lay on this couch and someone's going to tell me all this stuff about me. And it's pretty intimidating if you don't have any experience with it, really. But the one thing I want to say is that not every therapist is a match for you if you're looking to go down this road. So there is choice, and I would encourage people to look for someone that is a safe match for them. That doesn't necessarily mean if they say something you don't agree with, it's time to jump ship and go to the next person, but someone that you feel comfortable with and that you do feel safe with. The other thing I want to say is that, therapy doesn't have to be just about digging yourself out of a hole. I think that's also a classic misconception. And I hear this from my peers a lot who are not necessarily energy therapists or energy coaches, where, people are motivated to come to therapy usually because there's something that they want to change or something that's going on in their life, or there's anxiety or depression or a life event. And what can happen after you work through those issues is there is this whole aspect about personal growth, like you mentioned, and getting better at just being yourself and who you want to be. So I don't believe that therapy just has to stop once you kind of, I call it, dig yourself out of a hole, right? So the other thing that I hear, and I hear this from athletes a lot, actually.
And I want to talk about athletes eventually.
Yeah,
but
yeah. The other thing I hear sometimes is, I don't need to just keep talking about my feelings. So it's not just athletes. I hear this from other high performers, kind of like, what are we doing? I can tell you how I feel. It doesn't have to always be about that either. In fact, sometimes that isn't the best approach for people, which brings me to my third point, is that it's not about my one tool. This is about the therapist being able to be flexible to meet your needs, whoever you are, whoever seeks out my treatment or someone else. I believe that that's a more helpful mindset for you. My job is to work with you in your path for what you need. It's not about my biases or my judgment. I personally am a little bit directed in technique or things that we might be doing for homework or things that you're doing outside of therapy session. But it's not just about, I practice energy psychology techniques and I like this tool, therefore this is the only tool you have to conform to use. So I think that I hope that that's clarified for some people out there when they're thinking about this journey or not, or have reservations, that's kind of how I think about it, that there is a highly flexible component to the whole process. So let me go back and answer your first question about me and my experience. I think my experience is a little bit different on a lot of levels. Years and years and years ago, I would say 20 plus, when I was getting into the field, and this kind of goes back to, I know that you have a lot of interest in alignment and how things evolve in people's lives. Like, I'd never planned to be a therapist. I don't even know that you might know this about me, but I
And we
didn't.
don't talk about yours. We're not allowed. I'm not allowed to ask you questions. Only I've tried,
So
but it doesn't work.
So I actually was headed down a medical route. So I was pre-med, and I knew I was going to be a doctor from the time I was little. And I had some pretty impactful life-changing events where I had to just shift majors in undergraduate school and graduate. So I did so, and I ended up with this major that was kind of just a hodgepodge of a lot of things. And I remember my family members at the time saying, "What are you going to do with that?" And it was just so disheartening, and it was sad for me in a lot of ways because I really didn't know, because my life was just changing course. So one of my relatives said, "Hey, what are you doing right now? Do you need a job? I'm working at this place with people who have had closed head injuries, and it's an outpatient facility. Do you want a job?" I'm like, "I need a job. I'll take whatever." So I started working in this facility, and it was community based for adults mostly who had closed head injuries or strokes or some type of neurological damage who weren't independent with their living skills. So I was in their apartments taking these adults into the community to be able to help them with daily life skills. Long story short, I had to go back to graduate school to keep my health insurance. So I said to the psychologist there, "Hey, I think I like this work. What would I do or pick to continue in this?" And her answer was not the attractive one, but it was the real one. And she said, "Pick the easiest program, the cheapest program, and the quickest program to go through to get your master's degree." And I said, "Okay." So I did, and I ended up going into a master's program. That person since left that agency. About a year and a half later, I get a call from her. I'd never spoken to her in between. And she said, "What are you doing now? Are you about done with your master's?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, I'm working at a facility in the city in Pittsburgh. And we need someone to do some training and teaching and different types of assessments. Are you interested in interviewing?" I said, "Sure." So I went down, I had the interview, and I remember the owner he kind of just popped his head in the interview. And I thought, wow, he's really intimidating at the time. And he left, and I thought, oh, that's who I'm going to be working for if I get this job. So they called me the next day. I got the job, and it turns out that man actually has been my lifelong mentor. He's amazing. It's Dr. Greg Nicosia, who's one of the leaders in the energy psychology field. So when I signed up for this job, what I didn't really know I was going to do was begin traveling with him and teaching some of these techniques. So back in the day, one of the founders of energy psychology, and energy psychology are basically now a family of mind body techniques. But back in the early 90s, even in the 80s, Dr. Roger Callahan he developed the Callahan techniques, which now you hear it's called thought field therapy. So Dr. Nicosia had studied under him, and he had, a next level of these types of techniques. So he was teaching, Dr. Nicosia was teaching and training these techniques all over the country. And what he really needed, and part of my job was to organize these seminars and conferences. And he said, you really need to, learn these techniques too, so you can start using them with clients also. So I went through the trainings. And shortly after I went through the trainings, they seemed very easy to me. They were kind of common sense. And I was in these trainings, in my early 20s. And I remember the psychologists and the people that were coming to take these trainings were in their 60s, 50s, and 60s. And I'm helping them in these practicums. And it was mind blowing to me, because in my world, what sort of the academia was telling us at that point was, you have to be trained in a method for years. You have to have experience to specialize. You can't say that you're specializing in this, that, or the other thing without, a tremendous amount of experience. So here are these really experienced, specialized clinicians who had no idea what energy psychology was, again, or thought field therapy at the time. And I'm teaching them. And I used to get the question a lot, how old are you? And I remember I said to one client really early on, I said, you know what, if it's that important to you, I'll tell you at the end of our session. And I don't think that she brought it back up. But when I was teaching and training,
Why
this
you
really
never said your age, huh?
right. So yeah, but I didn't realize, it was just mind blowing. Again, I keep using that word, but I couldn't understand how these were so easy for me, and these techniques came so natural, and I really understood them. And a lot of people were really struggling and had to really have some concerted effort to learn these things. So I used these techniques in treatment under his supervision at the time, and licensure laws changed. So I couldn't work under his license. I did not have a license at the time. And I was doing neuropsych testing for him too, which is a whole nother area. So I was looking for other jobs as an unlicensed master's level clinician. And I got into this interview. It was called BHRS at the time. And again, we're in Pennsylvania. And this was community-based practice for kids and adolescents with mental health diagnosis. And so I remember going into the interview, and they said, what techniques do you use? And I said, energy psychology. And they said, what's that? So I had to explain it to them, and they said, oh, that's really interesting. And they said, well, what mental health diagnosis do you work with? And I told them all, and they said, well, this position requires you to work with autism spectrum disorders. And I said, no, I don't know anything about that. I can't do that. They said, well, you have to. And I said, all right, well, what do you do with this population? What kind of techniques do you use? And they said, well, behavior modification. And I said, like what? And they said, well, like ABA, token economies. And I'm like, and like what else? And they said reinforcement. And I said, and what else? And they just kind of looked at me. And so I wasn't as familiar with ABA back then as I am now, of course, but it kind of was mind blowing to me again. It didn't make sense to me how to treat these kids. So let me shift gears a little bit and talk about my experience with autism, because I'm going to get to how I blend energy psychology and behavior together in my practice now for peak performance. I learned a lot from staff who I was overseeing at the time, had really exclusive autism treatment from the Low Loss Institute in California at the time. And so I really got a good understanding of ABA. And even for kids who were profoundly affected with the disorder, how ABA really done well consistently could teach these kids how to develop skills. So nevertheless, I worked with ABA for years. I became a supervisor really quick. And I've always maintained a hand in direct practice at some level, but being a supervisor in this type of community-based practice, the system was really, it was really backwards. It was a great initiative, but as far as clinical training, what I saw is we were essentially hiring, and these were state regulatory approved, hiring bachelor's level staff with any type of bachelor's degree to come in and work directly with kids who had clinical mental health diagnosis, any diagnosis in the home for an intensive amount of hours. So I felt like my responsibility as a supervisor was really to provide as much sound clinical training as I could, knowing that this was a really difficult position. Nonetheless, it was developed to serve kids who really needed treatment on really large scales. So I invested a lot of my time in training those years when I was supervising in teaching and coaching my staff. Ethics was really important to me. It still is, because I do think that we have a responsibility to, people around us in our profession and personally even. So I spent a lot of time training staff. And then I went to an agency, and one of my colleagues said, oh, look, there's this position that they're looking for an autism director, and it's the Cleveland Clinic, you should apply for this. And I'm like, I don't know. I really think outside of the box when it comes to treating spectrum disorders and using ABA. And I said, I'll do it. So I kind of went into this interview, not just really.
Wait, what does ABA stand for again?
I'm sorry?
What does ABA stand for?
ABA is really applied behavior analysis. It's behavior modification.
Okay.
And I'll talk a little bit about that in peak performance when we move forward. That's why I want to kind of focus on this background. So I got this job, and it really was a Cleveland Clinic affiliate site to treat autism in a center-based program. And it was there that not only did I have pretty much day in and day out, we had the kids full day, center-based experience with really being enmeshed in the culture with autism spectrum disorders, but this gave me another eye and lens to go down the road with peak performance. So my staff, interestingly enough, a lot of them came from athletic backgrounds. And it seemed to be that the staff who did really well had some sort of drive, which in hindsight, to me, looks consistent with how athletes are trained and conditioned with their, their mindset. So this was a high intense center-based program. This was, we're moving to this, we're doing this, we're doing things at the same time. I'm responsible for this kid in front of me. I'm responsible for my energy. I'm responsible for 100% accurate technique, because we were constantly taking data through this program. So one day, and this is leading into the peak performance realm, I saw my staff, and I had cameras in my office, but with no sound, and they were amazing. I mean, my staff, I can't say enough about them. They were amazing performers in the work setting, and I saw them kind of in the background. I saw these kind of motions, and I was like, "What's going on?" So I walked in, and I was like, "Hey, everybody, everything okay?" And everybody's like, "Great, everything's fine." So I let it go. The next day, I kind of saw it again, and I went in and I said, "Come on, if you can't tell me what's wrong, I can't help you with this." And they said, "Work's great. I love my job, but I'm going home and I'm just exhausted and I can't keep it together." And these were some of their anecdotal comments, and that I'm, kind of short with my significant other, my kids, all those types of things. And they knew that I had this background in energy psychology. So let me just be clear that energy psychology techniques were not something I was using in this program. This was an ABA driven program.
You cut out.
I was saying that this was an ABA driven program for the kids, not in a place where we were using energy psychology for the students. But my staff knew that I had this background, so I ran it by my supervisors, and they said, "Sure, you can use these techniques for staff development if you like." So I did a quickie experiment, so to speak. I'm not a researcher by trade; I'm a practitioner, and I gave them, the staff, one breathing exercise to do 3 times a day over the course of 8 weeks, and I gave them
My favorite one.
Probably, yeah. And so I gave them a pre and post assessment, and really it was a quality of life assessment, and their quality of life seemed to be improved. And the staff seemed to really latch on to these tools and use them throughout. The really cool thing about this, though, is what they developed, and this was sort of their little language around them amongst themselves, was they called it flipping the switch. And in a nutshell, what that means is when they were at work and they were starting to focus on stressors outside of work, which even like, oh, what am I going to make for dinner? If their mind wandered a little bit, they dubbed that flipping the switch, and they were like, I need to stop that thought and change it and go back to being present, which in traditional types of therapy, specifically cognitive behavioral therapy, that's what the technique is. The thought block, stop the thought, throw it out, and change. That's easier said than done in a lot of situations. The difference is they knew what they felt like in their body when they had those thoughts, and knew the feeling that they had to get back in their body and their mind to be able to stay present. So that to me was really fascinating, and I sort of give them credit for setting the model and teaching me about peak performance, really, and how to think about that as individuals are on their journey of growth. So let me go back and talk about peak performance, ABA, and energy psychology, and how I link these together. So energy psychology is an umbrella, like I said earlier, of different mind-body techniques. They can be a lot of techniques. I am not a clinician who is over-focused on techniques specifically. Some people are trained in this, that, this, and their technique is very clear cut on that. I'm more about the mind-body connection. Quite frankly, the techniques can be very flexible, let's say that, and I'm one to certainly take advantage of that flexibility when I work with individuals. So there are different techniques. The idea, again, what they all have in common is the mind-body connection. Even if people say, I'm not into that energy psychology, we all have a mind-body connection. And we can take pain as an example, right? Especially pain. I don't know that I've met anyone who hasn't experienced physical pain that is pretty debilitating, that there hasn't been an emotional component to that pain. Whether it's frustrating, right? Or I am prohibited from doing the things that I want to do, or back to my 110% because I have this pain, there's still some sort of emotion that can be attached to it. And so the energy psychology techniques have a lot of research in the area of pain reduction. And I believe it, for the most part, it has a lot to do with the emotional components of pain. So we'll get to that in a minute. ABA, applied behavior analysis, really is behavior modification. I remember one of the first things I learned when I went to the Cleveland Clinic was the dead man's test, it was called. And the test is if a dead man can do it, it's not behavior. So basically everything we do is behavior. And when you start to look at life through behavior, it a lot of things become apparent if we just put the emotional piece on pause. So I like to blend these two together because, to me, if someone's coming in with an issue that they want to improve, right, this is ultimately about changing a behavior, whether it's a thought, whether that leads to a behavior, or whether it's an actual behavior. There's some element of behavior modification involved. So it's interesting when I teach this stuff together, when the traditional energy psychology practitioners will say, oh, ABA, that's sometimes not helpful and it can be damaging. You have to really understand what you're doing, and really use the principles of ABA, which are motivation and reinforcement. And this is how we start to bring these two together. The things that we get gratification from, whatever they may be, create a feedback loop. And they create a psychological feedback loop in our mind. The things that we do repetitively create a loop. Can you think of, I'm gonna ask you, Allie, basketball is your background, right?
I don't know if it's my background, but yes.
Background, I mean, that's your sport, that's what you play. Tell me about, is there a certain drill or skill that you would practice over and over again to get better at an aspect of actually playing basketball?
I mean, everything, I guess. I mean,
Give me one example.
Like dribbling drills, I guess.
Dribbling drills, okay, right? The more you why did you practice a lot of dribbling drills?
Because I sucked. I got picked all the time. I got my pocket picked all the time. No, just
okay, so basically, right, there are different skills. So you practice dribbling more to get better at it, right?
Yeah.
So this is behavior modification. The more we do this, the higher repetition, the better we develop a neural connection, and it reinforces that I'm getting better at dribbling. I'm getting better at dribbling. We do this more. We know how to do it more. So it's a constant feedback loop. When we experience distress, the same thing can happen. So let me deviate and talk a little bit about why we think these energy psychology techniques work. And a lot of us seem to believe that it's linked to Dr. Stephen Porges's work with fight, flight, and freeze, and the role of the amygdala in the brain. So really, when we're talking about fight, flight, and freeze, we're talking about the differences between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. When we're in a state of, in part of on this pole of the parasympathetic nervous system, when we're having comfortable interactions with each other, when we're in a calm state, there are also physiological responses that happen in this state, which contribute to our well-being. When we start to become stressed or a little bit activated, we might escalate up into the fight or flight stages, which becomes the sympathetic nervous system then kicks in. And so we have physical responses, but we also have emotional responses. Especially for peak performers, I see that these patterns in fight and flight, and sometimes even freeze, get really reinforced. Let me talk about one concept in ABA, again, how I link this together, and that's the 4 functions of behavior. According to the motivational assessment scale, there are 4 functions of human behavior. To get something called tangible, to get something in hand, to get attention, to escape a demand or to get away from something, and then there's a sensory driven function. So we can reinforce these functions, especially if we're learning how to dribble, right? We dribble more because we want to gain better skills, and we also want to feel better and be a better performer. So we reinforce different functions of behavior. If we have a stressful event, we can also reinforce a behavior that we might not want or doesn't serve us, because our brain somehow gets, I have a client say, tricked into believing that it's a comfort zone for us because we're used to doing the same thing. And this is sometimes where, and what I see in high performers, especially with athletes, where everything's great, until there's an injury, until there's an extenuating life event, something that happens outside of the game. Or, seen this too, where your comfort zone is, say, when I feel stressed, I dribble, right? This is what helps me get in the, doing that actually keeps the brain in more of that state of comfort, right? That's why it feels good. But it doesn't teach the brain what to do when you don't have access to dribbling. And this is
I didn't use that as a stress reliever, but that was, but maybe
yeah, right?
dribbling was not my stress reliever. That probably
Dribbling was not your stress reliever, but it might be someone's. It might be, right? Or even free throws, something.
Right. Yeah. That could be, that was on the court. Yeah, sure. The free throw line was my stress reliever because I could hit a million in a row. So I was not stressed at the free throw line. I knew yeah, that was my place.
Yeah. So I think that, this is where this gets kind of deep, individualized, and complicated, depending on what the need is. But what I want people to know and take away from this is that, we don't have to go into a whole lot of emotional exploration if you don't want to. And that's an individualized choice. We can tap into where the body feels the stress and then use some of the energy techniques to change the behavior.
Which is, I guess, we do that a little bit. I mean, I think that with me, it's more so and I'm getting better with not needing to know why, but I always, because I'm so interested in human behavior, I always want to know where it came from. And I know you've said to me a million times, like, why do we need to know? You can change it without needing to know. We can just fix it. I say fix it. I don't think you use fix it as much as I do, because I always come in with whatever it is and like, okay, well, let's fix this. Let's tap on it. Let's reprogram. Let's change the brain. And I know that when I first came to you, I mean, I played sports my entire life, and I've been around sports my entire life. And, I wasn't a pro. I didn't perform at, the highest level around the most gifted, athletes in the world. But I mean, I played competitively, and I remember, and I knew about amygdala and fight or flight. And I feel like a lot of people do. They're like common words now that people use, especially today around health and wellness. But you talk about the amygdala being up in a lot of athletes and a lot of peak performers or businessmen or whoever is in that, constant state of performing and going, that the amygdala stays up here. And when you leave those places, that's flipping the switch. You can't get it back down. So you stay in this state, and that's where your body's used to staying. And I think for me, that was, and we're still working on it. I mean, that's what I knew.
And that's such an interesting observation, because thinking about, American culture specifically, a lot of our media and a lot of the messages that were sent is to keep going, right? We're on to the next thing. When COVID started, I remember I was, wasn't too long ago, but the first thing I think that what I was seeing in posts and things were what to do with your kids now that they're home. And this was before, I think, some schools went to homeschooling. And I remember saying, okay, we're going to get on the schedule. We're going to do this and this and this and this and this and this and this. Scheduling can be great, But to me, it felt like more of the same of we have to keep going. We have to keep this moving. I'm not saying that that isn't helpful for some people, but we're just conditioned to keep going on to the next thing. What's next? What are we doing tomorrow? What, you know, that creates and maintains and reinforces those loops in the brain that get us very, very far away from quieting the mind. And the other thing I've been kind of saying a lot publicly, but I think that this needs to be said too, is a lot of the sort of mainstream recommendations for how to quiet the mind is meditation. And I want to say to people out there, if you are a very experienced meditator, if you're someone who's just thinking about it or who's tried it, I want to say that that's an advanced skill. And it's very hard if you just think about it. We're running and our mind is going all the time to say stop for, I don't know, 30 minutes, an hour, and really just quiet all those thoughts. So my message to this is please don't get frustrated if you've never done this and you try it and you think, why can't I do this in 2 minutes? Oh, this is too hard. Yes, it's too hard because you're trying to make me a professional basketball player, right? In a couple weeks. Not going to happen, right?
I know you have a jumper, Mandy.
Well, my height alone is just really not, not conducive for that problem. But it's an advanced skill. It takes practice. There are other things that can help start to relax the mind to get to that point. So even though that's a commonly, I think, a common recommendation, I just hope people don't get discouraged and try it once or twice and think, I just can't do this. It's too much. It is a lot.
So basically, though, quieting the mind is where I mean, we always talk about living in this place of internal joy. And I mean, obviously, there are external factors that go on all the time. And the goal is to not let those external factors influence your internal, state of being. And so I know that we work a lot on whether it's career, or, a relationship with a friend or a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a coach or a boss or whoever it is, or the weather outside, if it's raining and versus being sunny. I know that, we've worked a lot with me on finding that inner joy. And when I first came to you, you asked me if I associated my self-worth with my career. And I couldn't honestly answer you no to that because I felt like I was in a place where, it's especially growing up playing sports, there are expectations. There are, you're supposed to do this. You put all this time in because, you travel every weekend with your AAU team because you want to get letters from colleges. Then you want to play in college, you get a scholarship. And then, when you go on to the real world, a lot of times people like former athletes just because they think that they have, a certain mindset and a certain motivation and things like that. So I think it had to do a lot with like expectation of, and I don't think for everyone, I think a lot of people, do what they do and they're happy and it's fine. But at some point, I think a lot of people are like, am I doing this because this is really what's fulfilling me? Or was this the expectation that I had for myself at a different time of life in a different season, or that someone else had for me, or that I thought was going to make someone else see me in a certain way instead of, how I see myself. And we always bring it back to self-love. And if you don't see yourself in that way, then no one else is going to see you in that way. So if you're not aligning, what you're doing and how you're being, then it doesn't matter what's going. I mean, we also talk about, I'm into, frequencies. I do think everything is energy. We are energy. And, you want to be in this aligned state so that whatever you're putting out there is coming back to you in the way that you want it to come back to you. And so your intention has to be authentic. And if it's not, you're not going to be getting those things you truly want in your heart of hearts. And so I think it's still taking me a while to, what is the expectation versus what really fulfills me. And I think that, you have to be realistic. You can do both. I mean, some people focus on just that part of it where, I want to live a fulfilling life from my heart center. And I don't care whether I make money or whether I mean, you have to make money to live, but I don't care if I make a lot of money. I don't care if I, where I live, if I have material things. And some people, that is important to some people. So I guess, you really have to be honest with yourself. But one of the things that we talked about recently was trying to find that because we've done so much work over the last year, and I don't even know if I can honestly say, I always tell you, if someone says to me, you can't do this, I'm like, well, F you, I'm going to go do it. Like, watch me. And so I do have confidence and belief in myself, but, and I have such a loving family and friends and care. And we always talk about this. Like, I grew up in a family where everyone loved everyone. And, we would do anything for any of us to do anything for anyone. But when we talk about self-love and you tell, and when I say, I love myself, like I can't even now, like I can't say it without, laughing or having some type of, I'm very self-deprecating. I make jokes about things, and I'm aware of becoming more aware of them now that we've been working on this. But, I've realized throughout this time that all the work that you do, and, whether it's, your job, whether it's, for if you play a sport, whether it's with your family, if, the work that you need to do on yourself to get to that place of alignment and self-love takes just as much work sometimes, if not more, than all the other things that you're actually putting time and work into. And most people don't realize that, and some people don't care, and that's fine. And you don't have, that if they want to go about their lives and not focus on that. But if you really want to, grow and be aligned, it takes a ton of awareness. And we don't live in a state of constant awareness and consciousness and being in the moment. For me, I feel like that's where energy therapy and work is really advantageous, because it's not just, okay, I'm going to be positive today, or I'm going to change my thought. It's really figuring out how to get your body in a state of I don't know, just being how you want it to be. And you have to, I don't know, can most people do that? I mean, most people probably can't just flip the switch.
Correct. Correct. A lot of people can't. I found that the people who can are high performers, but at what cost are they flipping the switch? And that's when I find, when I start to work with them, or they're coming to me, that there's some error that happens there. And I do want to say, you're talking about a wide range of abilities and skills to get to some of these points that you're talking about. Are positive thoughts enough? They yes, and they might be enough for that person at that time. Again, there's a whole continuum of these mind-body approaches. Just thinking more positively is a great start for a lot of people who have never done any of this before. Do positive thoughts help everybody? Absolutely. Do you want to try to reframe as much as you can? Yes, because remember, and this is what Joe Dispenza says too, right? You create those programs, you create those schemas in your mind, and the more that you say them, whether you believe them or not, they reinforce a feedback loop. So if you wake up every day, and as hard as it is, right, you just look in the mirror and just say, I love myself, whether you believe it or not, whether you're like, ugh, after you say it, eventually it starts to embed. So just saying positive things really is a really good start, especially for people who might be in a state of maybe constant anger or constant reactivity. I mean, if you turn on any social media platform, there are certainly people who, it feels like they just live to sort of find the opposite argument and just pick the fight, right? To me, that's that sympathetic. That person's stuck in that sympathetic place, right? They can't say anything nice about anything. It's just about, what can I find wrong with this, and let me make sure that it's out there. So I think that we're kind of moving toward poles in a way. I think more and more people who learn about the types of energy work, doesn't have to be a formal technique, but mindfulness and becoming more aware. I think that body of people is really growing. And on the other side, kind of have yin and yang, right? You have a lot of still of the negativity, haters, whatever you want to call it. And again, no disrespect to either group. People are just at different phases of development. And again, that's how I look at as being a therapist. When I work with people, I have to meet you where you are, right? You're not going to jump from here to here in a couple sessions. Peak performers like to think they're going to. And, to some degree, this is the beauty of being a high performer, is that you do have a lot of skills to keep your performance high, and you have a really good can-do mindset. Again, it just depends on when that becomes in disabled for whatever reason, whether again it's an injury, whether it's a stressor outside, whether it's and a good example of positive thinking, right? Coaching has probably moved a long way far from it's about the win. It's about do your best. You hear this all the time on interviews, right? With athletes, we played hard, the team did a great job. You're moving into this more positive focus of doing your best, being the best as a team, rather than about the win and the external outcome. So you're moving.
Behind the scenes, I think it's probably not that way,
but nevertheless, I would bet that players still have to, in some way, be conditioned to think we did our best. This is another dichotomy. So you might be getting messages both ways. I'm saying this in public. I need to believe this, but I'm still getting the message that we have to win. This keeps the amygdala in a heightened state. The interesting thing about this too is it becomes hidden. I think you mentioned this, that you don't realize that you're in that state all the time. It can serve you well for your game. It might not serve you well outside. And there are ways that you can keep the performance, but manage that state in other environments. Does it take a lot of work? It does, but it can be done. And that's what I like to focus on, I think, especially for athletes, instead of using more of the same as your go-to strategy for relaxing, more dribbling, more free throws that just keeps that loop. Let's retrain the brain and find a different way, a safe way to be able to keep present when we're not in the game, to help the brain realize, hey, this isn't the time. I don't need to do that right now. I don't need to stay that activated right now. This is the time. Okay, now activate. That's really uncomfortable if you're not used to sort of changing gears or switching that on and off. The first thing that a lot of people will say to me, well, what if I lose my performance? If I'm so relaxed, I'm not alert, right? So here comes the fears, here comes the doubts. All of that factors into the mind-body connectivity about the perception of performance and the amount of control that a person needs to have on that. And it's different for everybody.
I know growing up, you were taught that, you had to have a certain level of stress in order to perform at that peak level. Like if you didn't have a little bit of butterflies in your stomach before the game, like then you didn't care at all. So then you weren't going to perform at your highest level, but you don't want to have too much because you don't want to, overthink things. And I think that when we look at the sports culture, there's so many factors, but it's almost like, is it the same as with, bioindividuality? We never talked about this. I guess I'm just asking you now because I'm thinking of it with diet and supplements and all these things, but where some athletes perform their best when, they have that added stress, and some maybe perform better when their amygdala is brought down, even though, you're talking about performing your best. Your amygdala's up here. This is when you perform your best, when you're out on the field, on the court, whatever it is. And then when you come down, you need to bring your amygdala down. But I don't know if you've worked with any athletes or people in that realm where you found that when you bring the amygdala down, they're actually performing better than they were when they were in this state of heightened.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good question, but it's a very individualized question too. And again, this is what I help the people that I work with explore. I need to really know everything about your states, how you think you perform, how you feel when you think you're at peak performance. Does that line up with how the people around you who are assessing your performance in your job, is that how they perceive that too? So there's a lot of factors. I know we're talking a lot about athletes today, but these are this can also apply to high performers in the corporate world. And I do a lot of work with these types of people too, who have pretty high demand jobs, and there's the pressure for the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, produce. Okay, shift gears. Even that. Okay, let's have a nice meeting now and be all cordial in front of that. I have to get back to this like immediately after without a break. All of those shifts I need to assess to figure out what you think works for you, what's causing you stress, what would you like to change. I don't have the answers to that for any individual. It's more of a conversation. But yeah, if someone says, you know what, I feel like I need this to do this, okay, let's talk about it a little bit more. Are you comfortable with that? Is that a behavior you want to change, or maybe you don't? And is it useful and does it serve you, or is it not helpful in other realms? With that, we can kind of work around it too.
And how important is being in alignment in all of this? You know, in not for just athletes, in everyone's daily life. I mean, how can being out of alignment, even if you don't believe, I mean, there is scientific proof of, you know, chakras and a lot being in different energy fields. So it's, we always say woo woo, you know, woo woo. I don't know why I said it like that. I don't know why I said it like that. We always say like woo woo stuff, and it's not woo woo stuff. But even if you think it is, has there been, you know, has there been research to show what can happen when you are in alignment versus when you're not in alignment, just in daily life?
Yeah. Yeah. So my first experience with that, and it's still one that I kind of use to gauge alignment or misalignment. And this is of course e- energetics at the diagnostic level for my clients. This isn't something in daily life practice for me. But early on, when I learned under the thought field therapy guys with Dr. Callahan's techniques, you know, he had a concept of psychoenergetic reversals. And this was something very evident to me that over the years, I grew a pretty good eye for being able to tell when a person, when their energy pretty much, the psychoenergetic reversal means it's pretty much flipped. And the way that I describe this to people, it's like, you know, when you're in this state potentially, when it's like, this is the day that everything went wrong. I just got out of bed on the wrong side and everything was wrong. So everybody has experienced these. The good news is that you can fix them pretty, correct them pretty quickly with energy psychology techniques. But that whole issue of alignment, you know, this is one of the tricks that I found that it's even a quicker way compared with some of the other energetic tools, in my opinion, to be able to start treatment when we get the person in a state of alignment, and then the treatment that we do downloads and it holds a little bit longer. When we talk about the research with alignment, I'm so glad you asked about that. My favorite person to cite in the research, although it's very heavy material, is Dr. William Teller. And he's a physicist from Stanford. He's written 3 books. Um, and he's really been able to show through a lot of mathematical formulas that I can't quite wrap my head around that, you know, our emotions and our thoughts really, you know, are our consciousness, and the consciousness expends out. It's not just within our body. And I think this is what you were talking about, how the influence on others. And we have very little research compared to um, the other therapies with the biofield. And that's kind of what his work is showing, that all of this in here, there is some sort of electromagnetical projection with that, which this is kind of what I was using the work with my staff when they're with the child with autism. One of the things that they used to say was, wow, when I'm in that state of presence and I am aligned or not reversed, wow, the kid magically doesn't have too many behaviors. Was it magic? Not really. What they said was, you know, their energy really somehow they felt affected the person that they were working with. And you know, this is kind of, I'd say this to clients too when they come in for the first time. If you're around somebody that's in a good mood and they sort of bring you up around somebody who's Debbie Downer, right? And you kind of are pulled down or dragged down. So I think that Dr. Tiller's work is really groundbreaking in showing that this isn't just, oh, it appears this way. There are probably things going on the physics level that we can't really explain or understand or see completely yet, but nevertheless, there is exchange. So to me, you know, if you think of your life in terms of any type of social responsibility, do I not have a not only have a responsibility to myself to stay aligned, but to those around me? As an energy practitioner, the answer is absolutely. If you don't do this kind of work, that's an ethical question that you have to ask yourself. But I do think that this completely contributes to this, as evidenced by, you know, the new science. And you know, I just want to say too, if anybody's interested in physics, physics is really progressive. I think it's a lot more so than we think. And back in the day, we used to use that word woo woo for, you know, people used to say that for what we were doing. Quite recently, to be honest, I've had some people really offended by that word But I think that the modern physics is starting to explore some of these unexplainable phenomenon and really trying to quantify it. And they're headed down that road. So I think that that's pretty amazing. As far as the other research goes for some of the meridian therapies, which thought field therapy and emotional freedom techniques are probably the most common. There's a lot of people out there practicing EFT. We actually don't know why it works. We don't know the actual mechanism. Do we have a lot of randomized controlled trials now to show that it does? We do. And I can give you those if you want to, put them below in the
Yeah.
description when we finish. But we do show that there's work and there is change, whether it's just deactivating the amygdala and help the brain calm, whether it's the actual procedure. Acupuncturists, interestingly enough, the ones that I've talked to have had different opinions about, tapping on these meridian points versus actually penetrating the needle. Some will say, this isn't doing anything. Other acupuncturists that I've talked to will say it's doing something. It might not be at the depth that maybe the needles are producing. I don't know that we know that answer, but we do have enough research to show that it can bring the somatic response down, and that's good enough for me. The other thing, again, as a clinician, and with all the COVID stuff coming out, I had heard two MDs have this conversation about research and what medicines, are well researched enough to try to use with COVID. And the one doctor, he said, we have research to show that it has been helpful, maybe not enough for some doctors' liking, but we're in a position where, you have to make an ethical decision. Could this have benefit, right, for a client? So even back in the day, before the research was there and the energy techniques, when I was working with Dr. Nicosia the first time, his office was known in Pittsburgh for like a one-stop shop. He had a chiropractor at the time, he had other services, but the people that were seeking out his services, and my clients at the time too, are also people that, the medical community had said, we can't do anything else for you at this time. And they had been on many, many medications for various physical health issues. And again, technology was very different than it is today. But pain and frustration were so much embedded in these people's lives, especially when the medical community says, I don't know what else to do. I mean, that's really a sense of hopelessness. And again, that's what's treatable with some of these techniques that we use. So in my experience, yes. Has it done a lot of really great things? Yes. Do I use you all and clients as feedback as your self-reports? Absolutely. That's what's the most important.
Right. And we don't really know what it's attributable to, like you said before, but if it's changing a pattern or a reaction into a response, or even just a response to a different response, then does it really, I mean, at the end of the day, does it really matter?
Yeah. And what I think happens and what I see with my clients is it lets the emotional mind or the brain calm down enough to get out of, wait a minute, this is threatening, to let rational mind, I talk a lot about emotional and rational mind, to let rational mind make the best decision for you. And then when you can, and you decide, you know what, the emotional charge isn't so high, I think I can follow through with this new change, which usually entails a behavior, right? So the energy work helps deactivate the emotional mind for rational mind to move forward with the change of behavior. And this is why, we talk about in the energy psychology world about how we think that this moves a little bit faster than traditional cognitive behavioral therapy. And that is, I think, the reason. We can talk traditional CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, we would talk these things out and talk about the loops and try to stop them and use the rational mind to help talk to the emotional mind to stop them. In my experience, does it take longer? It does. So we can go that route, but the energy techniques help more rapidly to sort of quiet that emotional mind to be able to make the choices for you.
Should we leave people with a breathing exercise, or should not? This isn't a universal breathing exercise that does it work for everyone? Should we leave them with a breathing exercise or no?
We can. So this is one. I think this is the one that you're asking me to do. This is left or right-handedness specific, this exercise. So it's a 2-minute exercise. This is actually the exercise that I did originally with my staff in the study that helped them over time. So This is a pretty comprehensive exercise. It's called the over energy correction. It's most recently being taught in the ACEPS certification program, where it came from. I think its roots were in brain gym originally back in the 80s, educational kinesiology. And there's variants of this, Crookes hookups, and Donna Eden uses this too. So if you are right hand dominant, what you're going to do is cross your left ankle over your right ankle, just sitting. You can do this laying down too. Yeah.
My feet aren't dirty.
So again, this is if you're right dominant. Okay. The next thing you want to do is you want to put your hands out in front of you, back to back, and take your right hand and put it over your left hand and bring them into your chest. I'm going to let you stay in that position, Allie. An alternative, if you have any type of joint or shoulder problems and this is uncomfortable, again, for people that are right-handed, you can take your left hand and place it over your chest, and then right hand on top this way. Okay, so go ahead and stay in that position. For those of you who are left-handed, you're going to cross your right ankle over your left ankle, hands back to back. You're going to take your left hand over your right hand, clasp your fingers together, and bring them into your chest. Why do we do this? Why do we sit in this hookup position when we're just going to breathe for 2 minutes? Well, let me explain the breathing and then I'll tell you why. So we're going to stay in this position and we're going to breathe for 2 minutes. When we inhale, you're going to inhale through your nose and exhale through your mouth. If you're not experienced doing this, a way to do it easily without thinking about it too much is to, when you inhale, you bring your tongue up against the roof of your mouth. And when you exhale, if you drop your tongue, it forces the breath in through the nose and out through the mouth. So you can do that with your mouth closed. And just breathe at a normal pace. So let's go ahead and do this for 2 minutes. Why we're doing this is when we cross the midline of the body, we're able to integrate left brain and right brain. And the reason that we're doing the tongue up and tongue down, inhale and exhale, helps to speak to top and bottom brain. So we're hitting all the quadrants of the brain. Again, what we think we're doing is helping the synaptic firing become a little bit more at equilibrium, and effectively, people will say that it feels a little bit calming to do this. If you're doing this and you start to feel worse for any reason, stop. You should not generally have side effects from this, but if worry starts to increase or your mind starts to go somewhere else, just please stop and do something that you rely on typically to calm down or help your mind be a little bit at ease.
I want to thank you for giving your time and your wisdom and your knowledge on these things, because I think that this is really important, and we all have some work to do on ourselves. It just depends, where we want to put our energy into. And, I was saying yesterday, I think that it really is true. The more you can do work on yourself and make yourself better, the better it is for everyone around you. So it's not selfish to be putting this time into bettering yourself and growing yourself, because it can only help you help other people and show up for other people. All right. Thank you.
Okay.
I appreciate you always. Thank you. Thank you.